one deep dive today here on the Will Cain podcast. A massive day in American history. A massive day for the Supreme Court. A massive day for life and a massive day for the Constitution. Last Friday, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned almost 50 years of precedent, overturning both Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood to deny that there is a constitutional protection for the right to an abortion at the federal level. It has caused an outpouring of celebration across the nation for those who have fought for the right for life for decades. It has caused celebration for those who understand constitutional logic. And it has caused angst, outrage, and at least some criminality in the streets. The temperature is rising. The nation is staring deep into one another's faces, yelling at the top of our lungs. And before this spirals out of control, before we let ignorance and outrage run and win the day, let's turn the temperature back down for a moment. Let's dispense with the ignorance. Let's call out the hypocrisy. Let's point at the violence. And let's understand the reason, the logic, the constitutionality, and the morality of this massive day in American history. First, what did and did not happen at the Supreme Court. On Friday, the Supreme Court of the United States decided that the question of abortion would return to the people, that the question of abortion would return to democracy. It was not, in the estimation of the Supreme Court, a question to be decided by 9 Supreme Court justices because a right to an abortion was not enumerated as a protected right in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has pointed out the role of the Constitution in what is a constitutional republic in the United States of America. We are not, despite how many mantra-like recitations we hear, a democracy. We are, in the United States of America, a constitutional republic. What does that mean? That means we vote together on the laws that will govern our society, not through direct democracy, but through a representative republic. We elect legislators to then speak for us and vote for us on the rules we would like to govern our society. But that democracy, that republic, that majority rule is limited by the fact that we are a constitutional republic. Now, what does that mean? The Constitution sets aside certain rights as protected from the will of majorities. It is, in essence, that certain rights, in the words of our founding fathers, inalienable rights, are protected from democracy. Of course, you know those rights. They are, for example, but not exhaustively, rights like the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of association, the freedom to bear arms. They are largely philosophically negative rights, rights to be free from the government's interference in these acts of a free man. They are rights that find their grounding not in a momentary fad of the 1700s. The founding fathers weren't the TikTok stars of their day. They were rather people grounded in classical education that understood these rights were time-tested for thousands of years, trial and error, debate and rhetoric, evolution. They were time-tested values and principles, rights derived from classical ancient Greek philosophy, from Western Enlightenment, from Judeo-Christian philosophy to have survived the test of time. Those rights are inalienable to man's condition. They are granted by God, and no majority will of man can take away those rights. The Supreme Court of the United States said among those rights is not included the right to an abortion. Now, the right to an abortion has been a right created out of whole cloth by the Supreme Court of the United States in the 1970s, starting with Roe v. Wade. Of course, you and I can read together the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and we will find no mention of abortion. So where does this constitutional right, this protection to an abortion from the will of the majority, laws that would limit access to abortion, where is that protected in the Constitution? Well, in the 1970s in Roe v. Wade, the justices literally, and I'm not saying this with a wave of the hand, they literally made it up out of whole cloth. At the time, the phrase was a penumbra of rights. They felt like it was implied a right to privacy, which then, in turn, included a right to an abortion through the First, Second, Fourth, 10th, a whole host of amendments. They also read into the due process clause that you shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness without due process. They read into the due process clause a new novel concept entitled substantive due process. Again, not something you can read or see with your eyes, but substantively it is understood to be a right of a free man in a free society. And this was how justices created a right within the Constitution that did not exist. They affirmed it and modified it somewhat into a impossible to understand undue burden test in Casey versus Planned Parenthood. But the point is, for the better part of half a century, this right to an abortion existed not through the democratic process, not through a constitutional amendment, not through the drafting of the Constitution itself, but through the active opinion of 9 justices in the 1970s and 1980s. And again, it is not a biased perspective to share with you that no matter where you fall on the morality of abortion, the vast majority of legal scholars, left or right, recognized, well, this is nonsense. This is bull S. This is weak. Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood were dumb. It's not name-calling to say the logic was stupid. And many, many on the left and the right anticipated that one day this moment would come. It did. It arrived. And what happened at the Supreme Court is they returned the question of abortion. And by the way, the question of abortion ultimately is a question that is among the deepest in morality, in philosophy, in religion, and even in science. It's truly a question of when does life begin? The Supreme Court of the United States returned that question, not to the decade-by-decade progressions of 9 unelected justices, but returned that question to man. For man to organize the laws of man through the popular will, and to man to be accountable as an individual to God. Now, here's what the Supreme Court of the United States did not do last week. They did not outlaw abortion. Abortion is still legal in the United States of America. It will now go to the states to decide through popular will, through the process of democracy, what they want, how they want to govern their little laboratories of democracy. And it will be that in several states, perhaps even half the states in this country, abortion to some level, to some extent, will be outlawed. Something like 20 states are set to enact trigger laws or laws coming in the next couple of weeks and months that should outlaw abortions. States like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and Georgia will soon outlaw abortion. Florida is advancing a bill that would outlaw abortions after, I believe it is, 15 weeks from conception. Other states like California and Oregon and New York will preserve the right to an abortion. And so citizens of these various individual states will have the opportunity to first vote at the ballot box and then vote with their feet to live in the laboratory of democracy that they so choose. This is what happened at the Supreme Court of the United States. This question was returned to democracy. Now, that prospect has created a toxic soup of ignorance, hypocrisy, and violence that must be addressed. First, let's talk about some of the reaction out there in the United States over the past weekend. One-time ESPN host and MSNBC influencer Keith Olbermann, who has been reduced to a literally rage-filled, spittle-flying moron atop a multi-million-dollar penthouse above Central Park in New York City, tweeted last week that the Supreme Court justices of the United States, specifically the 6 justices that voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, were domestic terrorists. That's right. Keith Olbermann said that Justice Thomas, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Alito, Justice Kavanaugh, and in his words, the paralegal, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, were domestic terrorists. Just take that for one moment. One conservative female justice, and this paragon of virtue, this woke hood ornament, called her a paralegal. As is always the case, invariably the case, they are guilty of the sins for which they accuse you. Olbermann called for the dissolution of the Supreme Court of the United States. He's not alone. Congresswoman Maxine Waters from California said the Supreme Court of the United States was illegitimate and they should be ignored. Listen. Deny the Supreme Court, says Congresswoman Maxine Waters. A man named Carlos Mazza, who is not necessarily a nobody, who at one time held quote-unquote mainstream media jobs at institutions like Vox, and also, by the way, was a quote-unquote reporter for Media Matters, the paid far leftist institution designed to create propaganda. And by the way, not for nothing, a blue check holder on Twitter tweeted a whole host of calls for violence. He said that violence has always been important to the cause of social justice, always been an important part of social justice, and that we should return to violence. How? Why? He says, well, the whole point of democratic governance is that it's an alternative to violence. But when governance is no longer democratic, you have to return to plan A, violence. He's not cagey. He's not hiding the ball. He's saying it plainly. He said fascists only speak the language of violence, and perhaps it's time then to start speaking the language of violence. Mazza out and out calling for violence on Twitter. Those tweets are still up today. Mazza has not been suspended from Twitter. Is it just crazy people? Well, it's crazy people now en masse, because at the Arizona state capitol this past weekend, people disrupted a government hearing. They disrupted a government body in session, legislative body in session in the state of Arizona, by storming the state capitol, which for the past couple of weeks, we've been told is a definitional act of insurrection. But when it comes to voicing a riotous protest in support of their cause, no inward-looking questions about their own insurrection. This is more than a double standard. This is more than hypocrisy. And I have more on this in just one moment. But I do not want you to think this is simply a former MSNBC and ESPN host who's lost his mind, or a radical far-left writer no longer employed, or no longer obviously employed. This also from a former Obama administration official, Ben Rhodes, one of the benighted intellects of the Obama administration. He said the current Supreme Court of the United States and its makeup is of such an extreme degree that it is no longer legitimate, that it is an illegitimate institution. Ben Rhodes went on then in a tweet thread to point to the illegitimacy of American elections dating back to Bush v. Gore that led to this moment of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. He called into question the outcome of Bush v. Gore, the election results, our democracy. And he said that that illegitimate election led to the appointment of Justice Roberts and Justice Alito because George W. Bush was then president. He pointed to the election results of 2016, an election that apparently it's perfectly kosher to call illegitimate, Donald Trump's defeat of Hillary Clinton. And this is in the very same week that we are being lectured that any questions of the legitimacy of a national election is by its definition an act of insurrection. The big lie. The Babylon Bee put this perfectly. Democrats call for a pause on January 6th hearings to commit insurrection. It's not just hypocrisy. It's not just a double standard. It's deeper than that. It is where I began. When you're on the side of good, then you can do all manner of bad. And when you're on the side of bad, you cannot be good. There are not two standards, there's one standard. In their minds, there's simply their standard. Definitionally right and definitionally good. No matter what you do, that is bad. I'm going to come back to that, but let us keep dispensing for a moment, if we can, with the ignorance. I'm a big fan, have been a big fan. As you know, I'm a big sports fan, and I am a big fan of the creation of Barstool Sports, and specifically El Presidente Dave Portnoy. I've never been under the delusion that Dave Portnoy and I agree on everything. I've never been under the delusion that Dave Portnoy is a conservative, and I've never required that Dave Portnoy is a conservative for me to enjoy his sports content. But it does require me in this moment to dispense with something that is not only garnered my disagreement, but that is so very ignorant. And I say that with no malevolence. I would say it to his face. And if he wanted, we still share a beer. But the ignorance has to be highlighted. Dave Portnoy tweeted this past week in his reaction to Roe v. Wade. He also said that he didn't understand why we were governed, why we were held hostage, in his estimation, by a document over 200 years old, the Constitution of the United States. He said specifically, and I'm quoting now, "I truly believe that the forefathers were told that over 200 years from the time they wrote the Constitution, it would still be the end-all, be-all for all major decisions in this country. They'd laugh and call us idiots. Let's write laws now for year 4050 and see how they hold." Attempting to point out what he thinks is the absurdity of adhering to laws, and I think in this he means a constitution that has survived the test of time for much more than 200 years. Because here's what I would say to Portnoy. First of all, it is a very odd moment to call into question the rule of the Constitution. It shows a fundamental ignorance of what happened last week. It shows a fundamental ignorance of the relationship between the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and democracy. It shows a level of ignorance about actually what is going on in the world around you, to be blunt. As I mentioned earlier, the Constitution is a limit on the government. It is a limit on democracy. It is that some rights are protected from the majority will. Let's talk about age for just one moment. Portnoy thinks it undercuts the legitimacy of the Constitution that's over 200 years old. Well, as I mentioned, the Constitution didn't pop up overnight like a TikTok trend. Our founding fathers weren't into fads. They had derived those rights, free speech, free religion, free association, from thousands of years of survival, trial and error, Greek thought, Western Enlightenment, Judeo-Christian philosophy. It was classical education and the culmination of an understanding of human evolution that brought us to the codification of those rights in the Constitution. Just because something is old doesn't mean it's invalid. I don't know if you're a man of faith, but I would suggest to you the Bible's gathered a little age. That doesn't make it invalid. There's all sorts of human wisdom collected over time, and the fact that it has survived time gives credence to its validity, not its invalidity. I would rather cast my lot with the survival skills and knowledge of humans that have survived thousands of years of over evolution rather than the current trend on Twitter. Forgive me, we can't even define what a woman is based upon current trends. I'm going to cast my lot with the classical values that arrived at the moment and created the conditions for the existence of Barstool Sports. But the Constitution didn't limit abortion yesterday. The Constitution is not, for example, Portnoy's enemy, because all that has been done is that the question has been returned to democracy, and there's nothing more responsive to the sentiments of the public of today than democracy. You can vote according to the fads. You can vote according to the trends. You can vote according to what's cool, the depth of the current thing, of what's cool. Democracy is the way for you to progress. The Supreme Court of the United States said yesterday the Constitution will not stand in the way of your progress. The Constitution will not stand in the way of your vote. It won't stand in the way of democracy when it comes to abortion. So he fundamentally misunderstands not just the nature of the Constitution, but the nature of the decision on this day. And it occurs to me this: if you don't like the Constitution, but you also don't want this return to democracy, and you also don't like the Supreme Court or these 9 justices, maybe you'd like another 9 justices, maybe you want a packet, maybe you want 13 justices, maybe you don't really have a standard or a process that you really love, it occurs to me in the end that you just want what you want, no matter how you get it. It's good to be king. If you were making a list of the things over the last several hundred years that truly created the concept of American exceptionalism, if we did a sports top 3 list, you know I love my lists, if we named the top 3 things that made America exceptional, I don't know if the Constitution of the United States is number 1, but it's in a tight race with our culture, the original culture, the one that attracted, encouraged, and inculcated risk takers, pioneers, entrepreneurs, those that would push west, risk getting scalped, start businesses, fail. It's that culture or the Constitution. To be honest, capitalism is a distant third. If you want to know what created American exceptionalism, it is that time-tested document. Again, it led to Barstool Sports. But that's not the only ignorance we have to dispense with today. Let's do this. Let's swing across the globe. Emmanuel Macron of France. Emmanuel Macron tweeted the following. He said, "Abortion is a fundamental right for all women. It must be protected. I wish to express my solidarity with the women whose liberties are being undermined by the Supreme Court of the United States." What we're attempting to do here is turn down the volume, slow the boil, shine some light on the ignorance, live in reality. We've talked so much together about the performative virtue seekers living in a fake world. As my friend Jesse Kelly describes it, living in the sky is green effect. Emmanuel Macron is painting the sky green. In France, you are allowed legally to get an abortion fairly freely through 14 weeks of pregnancy. The court case at the heart of this overturning of Roe v. Wade was a Mississippi law that limited abortions to 15 weeks. France is more restrictive than Mississippi Ron DeSantis is proposing a bill in Florida that cuts off abortion services at 15 weeks. Florida is more liberal than France. And that doesn't stop Emmanuel Macron from climbing to the top of Mount Fake Virtue and preaching to Americans. Oh, but he's got company. It's a pointy mountain, but there's plenty of seats. Justin Trudeau of Canada. That's right. Gen X Justin. Gen X Justin tweeted, no government, politician, or man should tell a woman what she can do and cannot do with her body. I want women in Canada to know that we will always stand up for your right to choose. Okay, let's give Justin Trudeau this. You can get abortions in Canada all the way up through 9 months. But there's some other ignorance and hypocrisy that needs to be highlighted with Justin from Canada. No government or politician or man should tell a woman what she can or cannot do with her body. Justin, what's a woman? Justin, who's a man? A man can't tell a woman what to do with her body. That very virtuous phrase rests heavily on the definition of two words, a man and a woman. Would you please define what is a woman? What more, Justin from Canada? No government, politician, or man should tell a woman what she can or cannot do with her body. Are we 9 months removed from you telling men and women what they can do with their body in Canada? Of forcing a vaccine to participate in polite society in Canada? Is there no end to the hypocrisy? It's not hypocrisy. It's not hypocrisy. It's not a double standard. It's one standard. It's their standard because they are on the side of good. And therefore, it matters not if they do bad. They are on the side of good. More ignorance. Senator John Cornyn of Texas tweeted, in response to former President Barack Obama. Barack Obama said, how dare the Supreme Court of the United States overturn 50 years of precedent, Roe v. Wade dating back to the 1970s. In response to that, Senator John Cornyn said, now do Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. Board of Education. Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that established segregation, separate but equal. Brown v. Board of Education was the one that said separate is not equal and overturned segregationist policies. Now, I'll lay it out because apparently it's necessary. What Cornyn is saying is precedent isn't good just because it is precedent. Just because Roe v. Wade is 50 years old doesn't mean the Supreme Court should continue to hold up a 50-year-old bad decision. He's pointing out Plessy, the segregationist decision by the Supreme Court of the United States that's separate but equal, is tolerable in the USA, stood for 70 years, and Brown v. Board of Education overturned that 70 years of precedent. That was Cornyn's response to Obama. But man, can I just tell you, I don't know if they're playing dumb or they're truly this dumb, but the number of blue check mark sports reporter, high-profile people that think that John Cornyn was arguing that we return to segregation, I don't even know what's going through their mind. Like, what do they think he's saying? He's like, now let's do some racism. Now let's go back to segregation. I guess that's what their mind went to because it's so atrophied with a lack of thought. But let me just tell you, I'm talking about like the founder of Dogecoin. I'm talking about people with millions of followers, of course, blue check marks. But as is always the case, I love to focus on sports because there's nobody more full of unearned condescension than sports writers. You've got here a writer for the Kansas City Star, columnist. Excuse me, he's been promoted to a columnist. Never heard of this guy. A columnist for the Kansas City Star, Sam McDowell. I wasn't going to call him out, but you know what? They need to be called out. Do you realize you tweeted this to the world? Did you think you were texting a colleague? What do you think he's doing there, Sam? Hey, Sam, you ever heard of Plessy versus Ferguson? Do you know what precedent means? Sam got a high five from Matt Verderami, who's an NFL writer for Fansided, where he just tweets, "Holy S." The world's so beneath them. They just can't believe the evil and stupidity that surrounds them. And of course, in the midst of it all is the high knights of virtue and performance art. Rex Chapman, one of the truly should put together a top five list of worst people on social media. Rex Chapman's right in the hot mess of it all. So many others are. So many others are. Willful ignorance or just wormholed, atrophied brain from lack of knowledge, thought, and curiosity, ignorance. It's important to highlight this ignorance. It's important to shine a light and knowledge on the ignorance. It's important to point out the hypocrisy. It's important to understand the arguments. And while this conversation returns to democracy, let's deal with one more. The red herring, the one you hear more than any other. As this returns to democracy, what man has a right to tell a woman what to do with her body? Who are we to tell a woman what to do with her body? It is a red herring. A red herring, an argument that exists separate from the one that is truly being had. Look, we tell women, we tell men, we tell humans what to do with their body all the time. I have a fairly strong libertarian streak that wants individual dignity and people to choose what to do with their own life. We just did a podcast with Alex Berenson just in the last episode talking about the pros and the cons, the unspoken cons of habitual use of marijuana. I'm not someone that takes that and says, you know what? Outlaw it for everybody. Maybe I'm with Alex Berenson now on the decriminalization side versus the legalization side on what we encourage, but I want to let you mess up your own life if you want to mess up your own life. I'm okay with mostly that. However, the abortion debate is not about someone choosing what to do with their own body. Look, I can't take a knife in this right hand and swing it around wildly, doing what I want with my own body until it stabs another person in the neck and go, whoop, just doing what I want to do with my own body. We have laws that would inhibit that right, of course, to do what I want with my own body because it affected someone else's body, someone else's life. We have laws that say I can't hit someone, I can't assault someone, I can't hit a child, I can't neglect a child. But why do we then say it's okay to kill a child? We're, of course, not having a debate about what a woman does, her choice with her own body. We're talking about the impact of her choice on another person's body. We're talking about protecting a body that so many fail to see is part of the equation, the child. And then that takes us to the crux of the debate. When does life begin? Before I move on to that and bring this full circle, on if you're on the side of good, you can do no bad, I want to acknowledge an argument that does hold some water. There are many on the left today that say this is the beginning. Next, the Supreme Court will look at gay marriage or contraception, and they'll roll back more rights. Listen, grant me a little bit of runway to give you just a little bit of constitutional and legal context. Because the right to an abortion did not exist in the Constitution, they had to find the trampoline to bounce off of in creating that right. They created it. It did not exist. It is not written in the text. And they found, as we have mentioned at the top of the podcast, the concept of substantive due process, that there are certain rights implied through the concept of due process, that you cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness without due process, that there are certain things in that concept that are substantively obvious or substantively read in. And abortion is not the only right read in through substantive due process. Gay marriage was, at the time, in about 2000, 10, 11, 12, making its way through the democratic process here in the United States of America. State after state was legalizing gay marriage. And gay marriage is something that I have been in support of, was then, am now. But the Supreme Court did step in and declare federally now that gay marriage is a constitutionally protected right. Theoretically, as pointed out by Justice Clarence Thomas, contraception is another issue read in through substantive due process. Theoretically, it could, logically, this isn't a moral issue. It's not a social issue. It's a legal, logical, constitutional issue. Theoretically, if you're starting to poke holes and question the concept of substantive due process, which should be limited, you could expand it to contraception and gay marriage. However, the Supreme Court, in this opinion, made it clear, Justice Samuel Alito made it clear, not on once, twice, not 3 times, but several times, that their rolling back of substantive due process was limited to abortion, that they do not want to move on to gay marriage or contraception because abortion deals with that deep and important moral, philosophical, religious, and scientific question of life. And then that takes us back. When does life begin? That's now a question for you and God and for us as we make laws. It won't be outsourced to 9 unelected justices. It doesn't exist as a protected right in the Constitution. And we're left, as we reconcile with each other, making sense of all this ignorance and hypocrisy. How is it you can literally hold hearings on an insurrection at the same time storming a state capitol? How can you do that? How can you call for violence in one breath and criticize civil discourse in the next? How can you say you stand for democracy but not want this question returned to democracy? How can you hold up the sanctity of institutions and call for the dissolution of the Supreme Court? How can you reconcile all of these inconsistencies, not just hypocrisies and not just double standards, but how can you reconcile these positions? And the answer is this: there's no double standard. There's one standard. And for a long, big segment of this society, they simply believe they are on the side of angels, that they are right and they are good. And if you are good, it doesn't matter if you're inconsistent. It doesn't matter if you call for violence. It doesn't matter if you're hypocritical. Can't define what a woman is, but still say this is a choice for a woman? No problem. That inconsistency doesn't matter because you're on the side of good. Uphold democracy as the foundation of society, but don't ever let the voters decide on abortion. Doesn't matter about that inconsistency. You're on the side of good. Hold hearings over a riot at the national capitol and openly call for violence on social media. Doesn't matter. You're on the side of good. And if you're on the side of good, you can do no bad. And those that are on the side of bad can do no good. If you believe that, you literally can excuse every step toward evil, including, in my personal estimation, denying the existence of life. Must be nice to be on the side of good. Must be nice to be on the side of angels. I hope today we brought some light to an issue that is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere when it comes to our democratic process. It's not going anywhere when it comes to our national debate. I do imagine it will play a role in our midterm elections. We owe a service to ourselves as we go to the ballot box, as we continue to debate, and as we hopefully do not turn and reach for each other's throats, to do away with the ignorance, to do away with the temperature, to accomplish some level of understanding. It would do us some service to invest in the opinions that we hold so passionately. I hope that I have helped in some way today shine some light, advance that conversation, provide some understanding. And if so, I hope you will share it with your friends. Copy the link, send it to them, share it on social media. And if you think it's so well-deserved, give us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio entertainment. Leave a comment if you're watching this on video on YouTube or Rumble. Thanks for spending some time with me today here on the Will Cain podcast. I will see you again on Wednesday. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.